Well, I do appreciate the invitation to be with you. I have been here a few times before, and it's always such a wonderful joy and encouragement to me to be here. And it's good to know that others recognize exactly how humble I am and things like that. So that's a good thing that I'm sure the brethren at Custer Road will probably laugh about a lot. But I appreciate the invitation to be here with you tonight. If you want to go ahead and open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7. That's where we're going to be studying tonight. And I noticed on some of the slides a moment ago that your theme for this year is about the one another passages. Is that correct? That's so very fitting, too. I was really excited when the invitation was given, but especially so when I saw the topic that was assigned to me to give. I think this is a really important topic. And I know that when you go through the Sermon on the Mount, every topic is a very important topic. It's a sermon that our Savior gave, that the Son of God, God in the flesh, actually preached this sermon. So it's hard to say that any of the points are more important than the others. But I know that it is one that I've encountered a lot, not just as a preacher, as an elder, but also in talking with other brethren, not always feeling very confident about how to approach other people, or always feeling that maybe I'm not quite approaching people the way that I should, or because of my own faults, maybe I shouldn't be saying anything at all to another person. And we know how some of these verses, like for example, Matthew 7 verse 1 is the verse that is so very well known. It's probably the most quoted, or right behind the golden rule, most quoted verse of the entire Sermon on the Mount, to not judge others lest you be judged. And people use it against us by saying, you can't say that somebody is teaching wrong or what somebody is doing is wrong. And so when you go to approach someone else, they usually will throw it up in your face that, well, the Bible says you're not supposed to judge. And so I think it's a really important topic because we need to understand what Jesus is teaching in this passage, but also within its context. And that was one of the things that was very encouraging to me as I was studying back through these passages. And I've been through these passages many times, obviously, but when the topic was given, how to approach others, and then that was assigned these verses, it was something that really helped me a lot to understand some of the better context. For example, when Jesus throws in this idea of asking and knocking and seeking in the midst of this topic, how does that find its place? When you see things when Jesus talks about not giving what's holy to the dogs in verse 6 and casting pearl before swine, how does it fit within this context? And also how, especially when we're talking about how to approach other people. And so all these are very valuable lessons to us. One thing that I think the scriptures are very good about doing is talking about the importance of the interpersonal relationships that we have. And so tonight as we go through the class, and I do want it to be very interactive, so I'm going to be asking a lot of questions as we go through it, and then we'll bring up some scriptures as we discuss those questions. But just in the Sermon on the Mount already, what are some of the things that Jesus talks about, even in just this sermon, about relationships and interpersonal relationships? What are some of the things he brings up and talks about? Anyone think of some?
To love your neighbor as yourself.
Okay.
I don't have that in that wording, but yeah.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
kind of there in chapter 5.
Right, it's one of those things that you can kind of see this there in chapter 5. When you think about even the idea of forgiving men, like chapter 5, verse 14, for example, forgiving people their trespasses so that you can be forgiven. Jesus is pointing to that idea of having the kind of relationship with other people that you can forgive. And that golden rule that you're going to be studying, I believe, next week with Brother Jenkins, or Jennings next week, I believe is going to be on that topic as well. So yeah, that's a good one. What's another one? How you treat your enemies is a really big one. Jesus talks about that if you look at someone and you have this disdain in your heart for this other person, you really don't understand what your relationship with God is really all about. That not only does he talk about in the chapter 5 with those things, but also when he talks about, God does good to everybody. And that's going to play a huge part in some of these things we're going to be talking about tonight in approaching others. I think I saw a hand back here as well.
Turn the other cheek when you're struck.
Yeah, that's really tough.
Go the extra mile.
Yeah, going the extra mile and turning the other cheek, that's tough. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I would say when on divorce, that is
Yep.
God's one that touches all most of us.
Yeah. Especially the way that Jesus talks about it, doesn't it? Because in chapter 5, he says that if you do this to your spouse, this is what you cause them to do, right? And so it's not just that he's, like in chapter 19, setting the groundwork for what God's expectation is, but he's saying that this is what you do to someone else. One verse I think I challenge you to look at is chapter 5, verse 20. In chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus says that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of who? Jesus had a lot to say about the Pharisees throughout his life, didn't he? He says, unless your righteousness exceeds theirs, you're not going to be able to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And when you think about the Pharisees and who they were, chapter 23 is that huge chapter where Jesus just pronounces woe after woe after woe upon them. And he talks about how it was that they were not only shutting the doors of heaven to themselves, but to also those who they were teaching. But they traveled land and sea to make someone a proselyte. But then when these won over, he's twice the son of hell that they were. And Jesus even says that when you see them, do the things they tell you to do because of their position that they have, but don't do according to their example. And Jesus is using this at the very beginning. And so there's a lot of the things that Jesus points to in this sermon, like the divorce thing that he talks about in chapter 5. Because he says over and over again, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And that sets the groundwork for much of what he's been teaching. And so a lot of it does go to the way in which they have seen service to God exercised in the daily lives of a lot of people. Now, when it comes to this topic tonight, how to approach others, and be honest for just a moment. Are we good at that? On approaching others? That's one that kind of makes you kind of cringe, doesn't it? When you think about it? So let's ask it this way. Are you good at it? Because when we're talking about us, that's who we're talking about. I'm talking about me, I'm talking about you, I'm talking about each one of us. So tonight what I really want us to do is to think about what Jesus is teaching in these verses. And I don't think we're going to reveal anything that's going to be new to anyone. But I really want us to make some personal applications as to how am I supposed to be using this? Because Jesus' sermon is all about what does it mean to be a citizen in the kingdom of God? And what does God expect? And it's about emulating who God is. That's one of the big topics that we're going to be looking at, is that the way that we approach others is supposed to be in the same nature that we approach God when we approach him in prayer. And if we have that disposition when we're approaching other people, we are much more likely to have the outcome that God would want from that conversation. So let's look at that tonight together. Okay, Matthew 7, verses 1 through 5 is where we're going to start. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 11, but verses 1 through 5. Jesus says, judge not that you be not judged. Some of you may have a footnote about the word judge not. What's another word that's used there in the place of judge? Condemn. Right. That's very important for what we're going to be talking about in just a moment. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Okay, so these first 5 verses, the first thing I want us to think about is Jesus forbidding all judging? Is that what he's doing? That's one of the easiest questions for us to answer because we are exercised. We've conditioned ourselves to automatically know the answer to that question. So why do we know that that is not what Jesus is teaching? Why do we know that?
He gives context.
He gives context around it, and even before we get to the context, because you're exactly right about the context, but what are some other ways in which we know this?
Try the spirit, so we have an obligation to test that.
Yes, 1 John 4 and verse 1. That's one of the verses I would encourage you to write down. That we're told that we're supposed to test the spirits, to try the spirits. Don't just believe any spirit or any teaching that you come upon. You're supposed to try it and supposed to test it. And so there's going to have to be some judging that's involved. What are some other passages?
Judge righteous judgment.
Judge righteous judgment. Jesus also said that when you look at passages like John 7 and verse 24. Jesus said, don't judge according to, anyone remember the word? Appearance, but judge using righteous judgment. Don't just go by what you see, because a lot of times you don't know what's going on. I remember a story that one of the elders I knew in years past told me that he was He was very frustrated one service because there were a group of girls that sat near the front during services, and one of them would not sit still. She's fidgeting, she's moving and everything, and he was getting very frustrated about it. And after service was over, he went over and he scolded that young girl pretty hard after services. And she broke down in tears crying because she had poison ivy. And he judged by appearance and not using righteous judgment to find out what's going on. And there's a lot of times where there's something else that may be going on behind the scenes that we don't understand, don't know about. And sometimes we can judge it harshly. It's been a lot of times as an elder, as a preacher, that I've had brethren would approach me about someone else in the congregation that they thought may not look exactly the way they think they ought to look or behave exactly the way they think they ought to be behaving. And it's not necessarily that it's something that's a doctrinal matter, but it's a way in which this brother or sister feels like that doctrinal principle ought to be applied to this person's life. And they fail to understand that maybe this person has only been a Christian for maybe a few weeks and hasn't learned those kinds of things yet. And maybe they need to do better by exercising some patience and some long suffering to begin with. There's a lot of things like that we would do well to remember, that Jesus is not forbidding all forms of judgment, but he is forbidding some kinds of judgment. And what kinds of judgment is that? Unrighteous, which would be what? Yeah, I've got this huge plank in my own eye. You go to imagine yourself going to the eye doctor, and you're sitting there in the optometrist's chair, and he's about to stick this needle into your eye to do whatever it is that needs to be done. And he's wearing huge bifocals with smudges all over it. You're going to stop that procedure very quickly. And what Jesus is saying is that you can't judge rightly another person when you have all these things that's going on in your own vision. We have reasons behind a lot of and I'm going to just put it in the area of opinions first. We have a lot of reasons for the opinions that we hold about things. And sometimes we do want those opinions to be enforced upon others because it became our opinion because obviously that's the right way to think about things. And other people didn't think that same way about it. And also, even when it comes to doctrinal things, that there are doctrinal things that we are supposed to be judging correctly about. But we also have to understand that we're trying to persuade people to become more like Christ, not drive them away. And so sometimes our zealousness, even for the truth, can be used against us. One thing that I have seen over and over again is that Satan will most often take whatever your greatest asset, your greatest characteristic is, and will find a way to use it against you. We are supposed to be zealous for the truth. We are to contend earnestly for the faith. We are to not have any fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. That's a verse in and of itself, Ephesians 5:11, that teaches us that we're supposed to judge righteously, and we're actually supposed to expose that which is error. But Satan can use that zealousness to drive people away instead of bringing them to God. Jesus, above all, is never talking about being accepting of error, but he is talking about the attitude we're supposed to have when we go to others. And so what is the guideline that he places on it? Verse 2. What does verse 2 say again? The judgment you use against others, what's going to happen? Yes. How strict do you want God to be with you? God's holy. There is no darkness in God whatsoever. That is terrifying to me. And then if I go to other people with the attitude that I am as holy as God himself is holy, and I hold them to that type of a standard, and I am that demanding of another person, that judgmental, that condemning of another person instead of helpful to the other person, there's a huge danger in that. So what Jesus is warning against is hypocritical judgment. If we have a hypocritical spirit, that's what that beam is. That I have this crazy ability to see what's wrong in your life, but I have no understanding whatsoever of the problem and the error in my own life. And that's what Jesus is condemning, and that's what we're supposed to be watching out for. So what does Jesus mean then by the same measure that we use to judge others is what we're going to be judged by. What does he mean by that? Can you think of any scriptures or any place in the Bible where something like that maybe has happened or you've seen it? Let's think about the book of James. Let's go to James and notice a couple things. James 2. And somebody read verse 13. James 2 and verse 13.
For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
Okay. And again, what is it that you want when you're going to be judged? I want mercy. What's the difference between mercy and grace?
Grace is something we don't deserve that God gives us, and mercy is something we do deserve He doesn't give us.
Right. And that's one of those classic things that is so important to have ingrained within us. Mercy is the thing that we get when justice is what we deserve, but mercy is what we get instead. Grace we don't deserve, and God gives it to us. God's justice, His condemnation, we do deserve that, but because of mercy we don't receive it. It's not just grace, but it's also mercy. And I do pray to God for mercy. There are sins that many of us struggle with, and they're repetitive. They're always coming up. You know, it may be that every time you get on the road, there's that same old sin. You know, the anger or the frustration with other people. You know, I mean, I admit, I judge other people by the way I think they ought to be driving, and they're not doing it right. And so I get very judgmental about that. But I do want mercy when I'm at the red light and I'm daydreaming and I forget that the light has turned green, and then somebody blows the horn at me and is very mad and gives me that ugly look when they go driving by real fast. You know, the same measure you judge others by is how God's going to judge you. That's why it's so important when we talk about this idea of approaching others, that if we have the first and foremost in our minds, when I go to this brother or sister about this sin that's in their life, or I go to this brother and sister because I see them struggling and I want to help them to grow, when I see that they may not be where they need to be, and I want to talk to them about that, and I go to approach them, if I first go with the attitude is I want to approach them the same way that I want God to deal with me. And really, when we look back at it, for most of us, the way that God has already dealt with us, that I want the best outcome for them the same way that God wants the best outcome for me. If that's the approach I'm going to have, I'm probably going to be a whole lot more successful than dealing with it some other kind of way. James chapter 4. James 4, verses 11 and 12. Somebody read that. James 4, 11 and 12.
Do not speak evil of one another, brethren. Each who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge another?
How blunt is that last statement in verse 12? Who are you to judge another? You know, we've already pointed out that Jesus is not condemning all forms of judgment. But what he's talking about here is you're speaking evil of a brother, and you don't even, and you've got the position that you are the lawgiver on the topic. Have you ever run across a brother or sister that seems to think that way? That they're the lawgiver. And when they talk to you, they have that attitude, that disposition. Well, I will tell you what is right and wrong, and you just need to listen. They probably don't even let you respond when you try to talk to them. And it's usually not a conversation so much as it is a directive that's being given from on high. And it's one of those things that James is saying is even existing amongst them. They're speaking evil of one another. Because it's not a matter of just pointing out fault. It's a matter of speaking evil. That not only are you wrong, but you're wrong because of who you are, the way that you think, The way you haven't done this, the way you haven't done that, the way you should have done this, the way you should have done that. And all that gets added to it, and what it turns into is a speaking evil instead of actually a helpful rebuke, which is what it's supposed to be. And because of that, James says, who are you to speak evil of another? So when you look at verses 1 through 5 then of Matthew chapter 7, what is the overall point of this passage, of this part of the passage? What would you say it is? If you just had to wrap it up in one thing, what is it? Don't judge. Jesus did it pretty succinctly himself, didn't he?
Caution.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Caution.
Caution, yes, very much so. I think when you look at it, the point is this: until we deal with our own issues, we can't truly help anyone else. Again, Jesus isn't condemning all forms of judging. When you look back there at Matthew 7, verse 1 through 5, he says, first remove the plank from your own eye. Then you will be able to see clearly how to help another. And so what it's about is make sure that you are testing yourself, examining yourself with God first and foremost. Then you will be able to go to that brother a whole lot better. Galatians 6 and verse 1. Somebody read that. Galatians 6 and verse 1.
Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted.
Galatians 6:1 is one of those verses that you can have a whole sermon just in one short verse. He says, that if somebody's overtaken in a trespass, in other words, this person has fallen into basically a trap that Satan has laid for them, and they've fallen victim to it. We can go to them and say, you should have seen this coming. Proverbs 1 talks about surely the net is spread in the presence of any bird. You should have known that Satan's going to get you this way. But that's not the way we're supposed to do it. But the one who restores him is supposed to be what kind of a person? You who are spiritual. Now, this is a person who has already been trying to live their life the way that they should and are spiritually minded. It doesn't say it's only the elders or the preacher. It's you who are spiritual. Did you have something?
Yeah, when you think of the term judge or judgment, like me, you're thinking automatically a court system.
Yeah.
And what's the judge called? You refer to him as your honor.
Right.
So you're already putting them in a place of authority who is making the call there, right? But you look over at 2 Timothy 3:16, and it's talking about the word used for correction. What's doing the judgment there is the word.
Right.
And it makes me think of the fact that you've got a completely different position. If the word is doing the judgment and you're going to your brother out of love, and you all have the same goal of heaven, you're helping one another as opposed to calling them out and saying, you're wrong.
Right.
It's the sin that's wrong.
Yeah, it is. One of the things that I try to encourage people to do when they have some type of an issue or problem, whether it's a doctrinal difference, whether it's an opinion, or whether it's just a difference of personalities and they're just fighting with each other, is trying to get both of them to identify what is the actual problem, put it in the middle of the table, and instead of both of you talking to one another across the table, both of you get on the same side of the table and look at the problem, look at what the issue is, and solve that, because that's the thing that needs to be taken care of. One verse I want us to remember along these lines as well, Psalm 139. Go ahead and turn to Psalm 139, verse 23 and 24. The goal of what Jesus is talking about is not condemnation. It's about restoration. And how is this accomplished? We remove the plank from our own eye, then we can see clearly what is wrong in the situation with the other person. One of the things that I think we should start with is this prayer that's here in Psalm 139. This is actually a very scary prayer to pray, but I think it's one that we need to do more often. Psalm 139, verses 23 and 24. It says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." It is scary to go to God and just tell God, please take a look at me. He knows already. We already know that he knows already. But actually saying to God, please do this. I'm inviting you to do this. Please show me. Please search me. Know my heart. Know my anxieties. Know my issues. If there's any wicked way in me, point it out. That's a scary prayer. But I believe that's what Jesus is pointing to in this. Yes, ma'am.
Now, I love the way you have your point that until we deal with our own issues. However, I would caution that sometimes we know we have sins, we don't want to do what 139 says, and so we just leave it all alone.
Right.
And I don't think that's the point of Matthew 7. I think the point of Matthew 7 is there's judging that needs to be
Right.
done. And that means I need to get my life right so that I can help restore.
Right.
It's not a either or. It's a, you have to do both.
Right. There is an expectation that Jesus has in this sermon.
Yeah.
And that expectation that you see is in those last few verses, that whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them. Jesus is not saying that these are optional things. He's saying that when you do these things, this is the way to go about doing. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Excellent point indeed. Okay, so let's go back to Matthew 7 and look at verse 6. Now, I got to admit that for a very, very long time, verse 6 seemed awkward. In that, why is verse 6 there? Why is verse 6 after this idea of judging but not being a hypocrite when you judge? And after that is about praying to God and asking God for things. So what is the point of verse 6? Verse 6 says, do not give what is holy to dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Now, why is verse 6 there? Besides Jesus deciding it needed to be there. Why is verse 6 there?
Is he talking about, I have dealt with a group of people before, and you reach a point where, you know, there's no interest there on their part. You're just wasting your time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're exactly right. So verses 1 through 5 is about approaching others with self-examination. Verse 6 is really the idea of approaching others with discernment. Because no matter what you do and how it is that you try to approach other people, not everybody is actually prepared to hear what you have to say. That's difficult. I mean, Jesus, if you think that there would be somebody that people would easily listen to, Jesus is him. But there were many times that Jesus was not accepted. So, is everybody ready for that? Let me ask you, have you always been ready for it?
No.
How many of you fought obeying the gospel for a while? You know, if somebody was trying to teach you the gospel, what it took for you to be saved, and you just weren't hearing it. This whole idea about being, immersed in some water, that for some reason you thought that was going to wash away your sins, and you thought that was just a silly idea. Or maybe you came out of denominationalism and you made fun of these Church of Christ people because you believe the devil lives in the piano or something. You just fought against it. You weren't ready for it. You weren't ready to hear it. Or maybe because the sin that you were committing, you weren't ready to quit. Truth is, there's probably several in this audience tonight, several of us in this audience tonight, probably aren't ready to hear some cold hard facts about some of the sins that we are guilty of, some of the ways that we think, some of those hidden things in the heart, some of those secret things that are going on that no one else knows about. Maybe some of those things that you think about that you don't want other people to know that you think about. Not everybody's always ready for help or for correction. And so what Jesus is teaching us is that we need to be careful about casting what is holy to the dogs and giving our pearls to swine. Who is Jesus referring to? These are some strong words. Who is Jesus talking about? Who is this? Unbelievers? Could be. People that don't want to believe. And I think that's more precise there. I like that way you said that. Yeah, they don't want to believe.
The Gentiles were considered dogs.
A lot of them did consider it, but the Gentiles were more receptive oftentimes, weren't they?
You could have been talking about the Pharisees.
Yep. Remember when Jesus was telling some of his parables and the scribes and Pharisees looked at him and said, I think you're talking about us. I was like, yes, he's talking about you. But they weren't ready to hear it. And when they did perceive that he was talking about them, what did they try to do? Kill him. Yep. Many times. Yes, ma'am.
Proverbs 9, verse 7 and 8, it says, "He who corrects a scoffer gives shame for himself, and he who rebukes a wicked man only harms himself. Do not correct a scoffer lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you."
That was actually one of the passages I was about to go to. That's an excellent passage. There's another one in Proverbs I want us to go to as well. But it's almost like Jesus is quoting from that, really, paraphrasing it, if you will. Because it does say that if you are going to rebuke a person, you need to make sure it's somebody who's going to listen to it. A rebuke, to some people, it's just falling on deaf ears. And we need to be discerning about this. Some of the verses I really love in Proverbs are along these lines. Proverbs 26. Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Sometimes people try to find contradictions in the Bible where the Bible contradicts itself. It says one thing and then says another. Here's two verses back to back, if you want to find two verses that say back to back contradictory things, but for very good reasons. Proverbs 26, verse 4 and 5. Verse 4 says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him." Verse 5 says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." So it tells us that there's two different approaches to someone who is a fool. Sometimes you need to answer him. Sometimes you don't need to answer him. Sometimes you need to address his folly. Sometimes you don't. It says that if you answer a fool according to his folly, you end up looking like him. You ever felt that way? You're arguing a point with someone, not arguing, debating with someone, and that's what it ends up looking like. Well, he does say in the next verse, answer a fool, lest he be wise in his own eyes. But if he decides he's not going to listen to you, some people like to argue and like to fight. And if there's not some kind of issue or problem, they don't have anything it seems to get them through the day. It says, don't bother with people like that.
Some people love to do that with religious people.
They do, especially,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
You ever seen it on Facebook? You ever done it on Facebook? It's all the time. You see it. And, I was saying at the beginning that this is one of the things that I've had brethren talk about many times over the years with me about is approaching other people and what's the right way and the wrong way. And one of the ways is a lot of times when it comes up on Facebook. It's somebody they don't know, they've never met, they're probably never going to come in contact with that person, but for some reason they're their friend on Facebook. And then there's this argument that's put forth out there and they're getting involved in it, and it ends up just looking like a lot of foolish gesturing, and it's not going anywhere. Sometimes we need to get involved, and you can put your dog in the fight if you want to, but understand there's also a time where it's better just to keep quiet about it and not get involved. Yes, ma'am.
There's a famous quote that goes something like, "Don't argue with a fool, because an onlooker can't determine who the fool is."
You're right. Exactly. That's a really good point too. And I've been there before where it seems that way, and it's not always easy just to say, I'm just not going to say anything. I can't remember exactly in Proverbs where it's at, but it talks about, or it could be Ecclesiastes, where it says that a person who gets involved in the fight that belongs to two other people is like grabbing a dog by both ears. And what it's symbolizing is that if you grab a dog by both ears, where do you get bit? Both arms, right? And so if you get involved in something that doesn't concern you, you're going to get bit from both sides. You're going to get it from both sides. You're not going to be appreciated for it. So we need to be very discerning. Again, it doesn't mean that we never get involved and we never say anything. It's not any of that. But it's about not being hypocritical. And it is, like it says here, we need to be very, very discerning about what we get involved in. The point is this, is that we are stewards of God's truth. And I'm not sure that we always think of ourselves as being that way. That is a very solemn responsibility that we have. That we are stewards of God's truth. We are the vessels that God is using to spread His gospel, to teach the world. And if we're not careful about that, I appreciate the prayer that was given at the very beginning of services, because it it was mentioned about how to spread the gospel to other people. And as stewards of God's truth, we need wisdom to know when to speak and also when to remain silent. Not everything needs to be said all at once. And when trying to teach other people and trying to reach other people, not every topic has to be addressed all at the same time. There were many people that Jesus encountered that as he was teaching them, there were a lot of things that Jesus could have taught them and said to them that he didn't at that point. But he took them from where they were at to where they needed to be at that time. And we need to exercise that same kind of wisdom. All right, so we need to have self-examination. We need to have discernment. 2 Timothy 2, before we go off of this, 2 Timothy 2, 23 through 25 is a very good verse to remember as well. 2 Timothy 2, verses 23 through 25. Remember, Paul is writing to this young evangelist, and this is what he tells him. Avoid foolish and ignorant disputes, knowing that they generate strife. And a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach and patient, in humility, correcting those who are in opposition. And this is the point again. If God perhaps will grant them repentance so that they may know the truth. Notice two different characteristics that are mentioned. There's an outward quality that is shown. Verse 24, be gentle to all. And it's based upon an inward characteristic, in humility correcting those. If we first master the idea of self-examination first, then go to others with the intention of this is to restore, not to condemn, but also understanding that not everyone's going to listen. So I'm not going to cast pearls before swine and give what's holy to the dogs. I'm not going to do that. And so if the person is not going to listen, if they absolutely refuse, then as Jesus told them, shake the dust off your feet. As Paul said, you judged yourself unworthy, I go to the Gentiles. And that needs to be our attitude. Because at some point, hopefully, we've placed enough of a pebble in their shoe to where they'll want to come back. One of the things that I think is important when we're talking to others and trying to reach others is that you want to be the person in others' lives to where when they have those moments of deciding, I need to get my life right with God. I need to see what God expects of me. And they want to know, so who do I talk to? You want to be the first person they think of. So the things you say, the kind of character you show before them needs to be that way to where when they think, when they're going through those stages in life, maybe they are just getting married, we need to get right with God. We're having a child. I'm getting older now, whatever it is. I've got a disease now. And they think that I need to find out what God wants. You need to be the first person they think about. Be that person in other people's lives. And I think that's what Jesus is pointing to, because that's who we're supposed to be as kingdom citizens. Okay, so let's go back to Matthew chapter 7. And then Jesus, and this almost seems out of place, especially what we're talking about, verses 7 through 11. Jesus says, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks will be opened. Well, what man is there among you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So why is this, it seems that Jesus is talking about going to God in prayer about these things. Why is prayer something that follows right on the heels of this, you think? Or how does it fit with what we've been talking about? Yeah, you need to be right. And the best way to be right, you need to talk to God first. Absolutely. And there's a lot that we can learn with that. So we need to approach others with self-examination, with discernment, and with persistent prayer. That I'm going to these other people not to condemn them, but to restore them. I want to make sure that they are ready to hear. And I'm going to do everything within my power to make sure that they are not being hindered in hearing what God has to say about something. And so I need to be praying for these people. But I think there's also something else when we think about what Jesus is saying, that what role does prayer have in shaping our approach to others? Beyond the idea of asking God for help.
James says if you lack wisdom, just pray to God for it.
Right.
And many times we don't have the wisdom to know how to approach someone.
Right. And when I approach God for wisdom, I appreciate you brought up James 1. Because he says that if you're going to approach God for wisdom, how is that prayer, how is that approach supposed to be? It's to be made doubting?
In faith.
In faith. Because a person who doubts what? Doesn't give anything. What is Jesus saying here? That when I go to God, how does God answer my prayers? If I ask, what does God do?
Answers.
Yeah. There's an alreadiness attached to it. He says, as a father in the flesh, being evil, I think he's kind of using it, just showing that, we're not like God. But he says, that you don't play tricks on your children. You don't tell your children to come and ask for bread or something like that, and you give them a stone and you think it's funny, or you give them a serpent and you think it's funny. That when you go to God, God is willing to answer your prayers. That you should already have an alreadiness attitude when you talk to God in prayer. What does that teach us about how we approach other people? If I'm approaching God that way, then when other people speak to me, what should they get a sense of?
Humility.
An alreadiness, a humility that's there. You can ask me for help because you know why? I'm going to help you. When I go to God and I ask for help, I get it. When I go to God and I ask for wisdom, God gives wisdom through His Word, yes, but He gives it. Is there work involved for me? Yes. But it's there, and I know what it is.
The process of going to God in prayer and admitting our faults and asking for help with those, and that we have the right mindset when going to others, just that process seems to help set you up,
Yeah.
put you in a position below the.
Yeah. When I think sometimes you ever feel like God gets tired of hearing the same prayer from you? God, I did it again. I know I've asked for forgiveness before. I know I've asked for strength to not repeat it. I know I've studied and things, but here I am again, all over again. Sometimes people can feel that they're wearing you out too, that they may not want to come to you when there's an exasperation on our part. Really? Again? How many times did Jesus say that you're supposed to allow a person to come to you and ask for forgiveness? 490 times, right? Not 491, right? And sometimes it feels that way, I'm sure Jerry's experienced it, the elders in the audience, I'm sure you've experienced it. Really? Again? Again? And they even say it, yeah, again. How are we supposed to approach them?
I think when we approach God in prayer, if we do it properly, we do so knowing that whatever He answers is going to be the best thing for us.
That's it.
And when we approach people, we should have a relationship with them that they feel that whatever we do relative to the things they ask is going to be that which is best for them.
Absolutely. There's a lot about God's character that we learn in these verses, and that has a huge bearing on our prayers and also the way in which we approach other people. Some of the things that you see about God in these verses, you see God's generosity, you see God's being present, that when I ask, I don't have to go looking for Him. He's there. That we see Him being accessible, that I'm in need, I'm asking God again for something. But God's still accessible. I ask, he gives. I knock, he opens. I seek, he shows it. We see that he is good. As our brother said just a moment ago, that he is good. He's going to give what is needed. It may not always be what is wanted, but it is what is needed always. I'm not a big believer in God necessarily saying no to prayers. I'm a believer in God saying, you ask for this, but you need this. Much more like he did with Paul. Paul is one of the thorn in the flesh, and God doesn't just tell him no. That's not who our God is. God says, what you need is grace, to understand that my grace is sufficient for you. That's what you need. And I believe that's how we're supposed to be in response to other people, is that it's not what they want necessarily, but it is always what they need. And they always know that we have their best interests at heart. They always know that we are coming to them because we want them restored. We want them better. We want them to grow. And we want them to improve. And so for this part here, go to God before you go to people is the best advice I think we can have when it comes to approaching others. Go to God before you go to others. Go to God and say, God, examine me. Look at me and see if there's anything I need to correct. Go to God and say, God, help me to be wise. Help me to be a good steward of the truth that you've imparted to us. And God, help me to approach this person the way that I should. So is this where we're off the invitation at this point? Okay. So by way of invitation, some practical takeaways. These are some things I think that we need to be thinking about, is that we do need humility. Before we ever go about criticizing other people, we need to be asking ourselves, do I want to be judged by that same standard? And always be about, correcting my own faults first before I try to help someone else with theirs. You're not going to ever be perfect. So as was pointed out earlier in the class, don't use it as an excuse to never approach someone that you're not perfect. But as you're working on things through your life, help others who are working through those same kinds of things. Use some discernment. You're supposed to notice other people's readiness. If someone rejects help, be wise. And perhaps they need time. Maybe it's just not right now, but in the future, they may be ready. And then always have something where you can come back and open that door again if possible. Love and prayer. Always adopt a spirit of seeking God's guidance in all your interactions. Approach conversations with a mindset of giving good, not condemnation. Again, I want to say how much I appreciate that this topic was given to me. It was a very good study for me, and it helped me to understand some things that I can do better, that I need to be thinking more about, that sometimes I get it in reverse. I think that I'm the one who can fix this problem, and I know how to do it. I've been through these scenarios before. I know what has worked in the past. I've seen how these things have turned out in the past, and so, I immediately try to jump on the problem and the issue and whatever it is. And I may not be thinking about the fact that God is the one who's supposed to be fixing this. I'm just someone who's helping along the way, and that I need to be talking to God before I ever even get involved in this situation. And I need to make sure that this person is prepared to handle what it is that God has to say to them. Don't just spill it all out there for them and expect them to do it or not do it, and whatever they decide, they decide. That's not the way it's supposed to be done. And so there's a lot about this that I think that we can use along the way. So if you've seen that you have failed in any of this, and I think these are probably some things that all of us can improve on, and if you need help in any of that, or if you need to become a Christian to where you can be part of God's kingdom, and you can start approaching others, at least from the understanding and knowledge of what it takes to be a Christian. If there's something that we can do, I know this is a great audience of people who are more than willing to help. Let us help as together we stand and sing. Please come.